Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the It Depends podcast. I, as always, am your host, Kevin Goldsmith. I am a chief technology officer. I've been a developer, an engineering manager, a director, VP, working over the last 30 plus years in the software development industry, including in very, very large companies and very, very tiny ones. I wrote a book this year called It Depends, writing on technology leadership from 2012 to 2022. In that book, I collect a bunch of articles and blog posts I've written over those 10 years. And that 10 years includes the span of me moving from senior engineering manager into director at a large company to going to a startup where I moved from director to VP, then leaving that company, becoming a CTO, and then my first few jobs as a CTO. So it covers a pretty wide span, not only of years, but also my own professional development. And in this podcast, we serialize the audiobook of It Depends. There's also a newsletter. The newsletter is also serializing the written book. So you can get the content either way, or obviously you could buy the book, get it all at once, which is what I'd prefer. But I'm very happy for you to get the information however you get it. This podcast goes through the book in order. The newsletter goes through the book out of order because, as I said, these are independent blog posts. And so for that reason, you can subscribe to both and get different content every week. Eventually, you'll get all the same content, but week to week, you won't get the same thing written and on the podcast. In the podcast, I also tend to give a lot more information about the chapter. I give a lot of information around the topic. I use the chapter as a bit of a launching point to talk about related things, but I also do a little bit of a director's cut, if you will, or narrative around it. This week, we're talking about the chapter, What Do I Look For When Hiring an Engineer?, which I originally published in 2013, so it's over 11 years ago. I don't get into very specific details about the hiring process, which is good because that wouldn't have aged well. We hire very differently now than we used to then. Hiring in our industry continually changes, and some of it is things we do will change because we learn that they don't work too well, or sometimes the candidates don't respond well to it, or you get different kinds of interview processes in job seekers markets and employers markets. In an employers market, I could argue we're kind of in that stage right now, and I'm betting some companies are using that as an opportunity to change their interview process. In employers market, you're probably going to be willing to ask the candidate to do a bit more before you hire them because you're not worried you're going to lose the candidate to a competitor. In a job seekers market, which we've had a lot of over the last 10 years, kind of leading up to COVID, from like the 2008 recession to COVID, in a job seekers market, you might change the interview to be a little bit more favorable to the candidate, just ask less of them, make the process go faster, because what you're trying to do is you're really competing with other companies for the best talent, and you're willing to maybe mishire in order to not lose a good candidate, right? So it's where you take the risk as an employer. Are you willing to ask more from a candidate and potentially lose them, somebody who asks less? Or are you willing to hire somebody that maybe isn't the perfect fit rather than potentially lose them? And there's that kind of balance. I'll tell you, when I first started interviewing and applying for jobs, this is 90s, early 90s. And then the kind of process we would go through, almost no candidate would even consider if a company asked this of them. But that is what we did. So, for example, when I was applying to Microsoft, I was being interviewed for Microsoft. That was a 2-day process. It was a 2-day process of whiteboard interviews where I would go into somebody's office or sometimes a conference room. They would ask me a question, and then I would write out the answer in code on their whiteboard. And the nicer interviewers would be paying attention and asking me questions about what I was doing. Maybe if I was kind of going in a bad direction, might even prompt me a little bit. The not as nice interviewers would ask me the question, turn their back, and then start doing their work or reading email or whatever, and then would turn around every once in a while, look at it, and like ask a question maybe, or just then go back to whatever they were doing. And it was on me when I was done to actually say, I'm done. Do you want to look at it? Those interviews too, it wasn't just Microsoft that did it, but Microsoft was very famous for it. The interview questions themselves were sometimes, or very often, questions that, real problems that have been solved by Microsoft employees, but problems that have been solved by Microsoft employees over months. It was never like, oh, we had this problem and we solved it in 45 minutes. Therefore, we're giving you this problem. It was, no, this is a problem that took somebody 4 months, a current employee, like 4 or 5 months to solve. We're going to ask you to solve it in an hour. And then we're going to make you feel like crap for not having figured it out. And the rationale behind this was we want to see how you solve problems more important than the actual solution. I don't know about that. I talk a little bit about, in this chapter, I talk a little bit about the process I eventually came to. And I'll tell you, and I talk about a question. I'll actually tell you what the question I used to ask was. So while I was at Microsoft, I was there for 8 years. And over time, there was a set of questions that sort of you would get. These were sort of well-known questions within the company. And what we started to notice, or definitely what I started to notice, is if I asked one of these questions, sometimes, but more and more frequently, a candidate would just get the answer like super fast. And then I would ask them, do you know this problem? And the smart ones would say, yeah, I read about it somewhere, right? That people were publishing books. Here's the Microsoft interview questions and here's how to answer them. So after that happened a few times, I realized, okay, I can't use the standard questions anymore. I need to come up with my own. And at the time I was working in Microsoft Research, and I would start, I'd get a candidate that we'd be interviewing for a role, and off the top of my head, I would just invent a problem for them to answer. Oftentimes it'd be something that I was currently working on, like a problem I was trying to solve. And then I'd work with them on it. Like, let's see if we can solve this together. That worked okay, but it ended up with giving me these really uneven problems. Sometimes I'd be asking really hard questions because I was working on a real hard problem. Other times I was working on something that wasn't that complicated. And so I realized it wasn't really fair because I was asking different levels of questions for different candidates. And I think there was a moment where I sort of realized, oh, I got to stop doing this. And I had an interview as my first meeting of the day. And I'd been reading some papers and researching a topic. And it gave me some cool ideas about, like new web image compressions that would do, back in early days of the web, one of the reasons why people liked GIFs or GIFs, however you pronounce it, I pronounce them GIFs. Because they could do some progressive refinement. There was a way that you could deliver them and have them be progressively refined, which meant in the slow bandwidth days of the internet, that was kind of cool because you could see the image kind of resolve itself as it downloaded. And I started thinking about a different way to do that. And I was thinking about it in the shower, thinking about it on my drive to work. Went into my first meeting of the day, which was this interview, sat down with a candidate, and I generally described, hey, I'm thinking of this new cool progressive image downloading process, which wasn't that far from what my team did. I worked in the graphics team, and we were doing stuff over the internet. And so this was actually very relevant to the work and to the job. And I described this kind of idea to the candidate, and let's work on it together. Let's think it through. And we're working on it, and the candidate's really struggling. And I realize I'm asking a lot from them, but I feel, I think this is cool. This is kind of a fun topic to talk about together. And maybe I'll learn more about them. And we're working on it. Don't make a ton of progress. And say, okay, well, we've done a lot on this. Let's talk about other stuff and give a candidate a chance to ask me questions and do the normal interview stuff. And the candidate leaves, and I'm sitting and I'm looking at my whiteboard and I'm thinking about it. And then I realize, oh, I just asked the candidate to solve quaternions. Now, we don't talk about quaternions anymore. They're well known in graphics, and this was, by the way, like a graphics student, I think a PhD, so it wouldn't have been wild or totally complicated. But this was a paper that had been recently published that I had read, and it was a mathematical way of representing signal data. And it had been somebody's PhD thesis and had been like a subject of research for a lab for a number of years. And so asking somebody to derive that on a whiteboard in 45 minutes was completely unrealistic, and possibly I might have been even a little bit cruel asking that. And I realized that, and I said, okay, I can't do this anymore. Over the next few interviews, I built and refined a different question. And then that became the question I asked for several years. And I don't ask anymore, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I'll tell you what that question was. So in the chapter, I talk about, I give you a problem, I ask you to solve the problem, and it's actually a fairly easy problem. And then I complicate the problem. I ask you to update your answer and update your answer and update your answer. The problem I came to was I described something that happened at my university, something that was a true thing that happened, which was at my university, the computer lab was on the 5th floor. On the 3rd floor, behind a locked door, was a Coke machine, a soda machine. And that soda machine was locked behind a locked door. It was near the machine room. It was stocked by graduate students, which meant it was stocked not regularly. And you would have to know somebody who had a key at one point, because I had one. You have to know somebody who had a key. And if you're in the lab at like 2 a.m. and you really want a cold drink, you'd have to like go down the stairs to the 3rd floor, unlock the door, walk in, walk down the hallway, get to the machine. And a lot of times it'd either be empty or your favorite soda wasn't there. And so eventually, because this was a CS department, somebody came up with a bright idea of, let's put a server, let's grab one of our old servers, we'll connect it to the machine, and we'll write a simple software that you can connect to over the internet. We didn't have the web then, but we had the internet. And then you can query a server process essentially to tell you what soda's in the machine. So this was somebody actually did. We all had it. We all used it. So I would describe exactly this, and then I would ask candidates to represent the state of the machine so that you could answer the question, do you have any Sprite? Or do you have any Coca-Cola? Or do you have any Dr. Pepper? You can answer that question no matter what your skill level is. It's a very simple hardware mechanism. So it's very simple to represent, and it's very simple to ask the question or to answer the question once you have represented the state of the machine. And there's lots of ways to do it, so there's not like one right answer. And that actually worked pretty well. Interns could do it, experienced developers could do it. And then, as I said, I would complicate it. I'd say, okay, now can you tell me, is there any cold soda? And then we'd have to talk through what it meant, how long it takes to get cold. How would you know when the machine had been refilled? Things like that. So now you had to actually really make it more complicated. You couldn't just say, okay, there's 5 Sprites, there's 6 Cokes, whatever. Now you actually had to say, okay, well, 3 Sprites have been in the machine longer than 4 hours, let's say, is how long it takes to get cold. Okay, and 3 haven't. When somebody buys one and I have to decrement the number of Sprites, I need to know, okay, how many of these are. And again, many, many ways to solve this. Assuming you got that done, which, to be honest, again, it's not actually that hard, and you can do it lots of different ways in any language. So it worked really well as a question, and then I would continue to complicate it. How much change is stored in the machine? Do we need to go empty the machine? Stuff like that. Until basically, and somewhere in there, the entire point of this, and I talk about in the chapter, the entire point of this was to start you in something simple So you hopefully, if you're being very pragmatic, and really this is a test of your pragmatism as much as it is a test of your coding. If can you solve it in the most simplest way possible? Because you can solve it in a very simple way and not overcomplicate it. And now if I make it harder, do you continue to just tack on your first answer long past the point where it doesn't make any sense anymore? Or do you at some point realize, you know what? This is getting too hard. I'm making this too hard on myself. Maybe I should do something different. And you restart. And usually, if you have that insight, I need to let go of my first answer and do a new answer, it becomes easy again. It becomes much easier and it becomes much easier to solve. And so that was really what this was a test of. But as a coding test, it wasn't very hard at all. But because it was that insight, and you could have that insight at any level of experience, one would hope more experienced developers would have that insight earlier than a student. But honestly, the results were, often surprising. Over the years, because I asked that question literally for years and years. Over the years, what I saw was hundreds of different answers and different approaches to solving this problem. And I would be constantly surprised. Somebody would come up with a new way of doing it that I hadn't seen before, that I hadn't even considered before. And it was really kind of a fun thing, but also over the years, because I asked this at lots of different levels and different languages, it made it so I really understood how well people understood it. And like I said, it worked great because it could work for any level of experience. It could work in any language. I eventually had to stop asking this question, and I did so very reluctantly when I would describe sort of that early story. Hey, in my university, this was a situation, and people would say, "What's a Coke machine?" Like they would never understand it. There was a period there where I had to describe kind of how these things work. They're gravity fed. They have a fixed number of slots. Each of these slots is wired to a button. Right. So I had to do that. And I had to do that increasingly for a while. And then I started getting into the point where honestly, people had just not seen these. Like you don't see them anymore. It's very, very rare that you still see them. And so I eventually had to just stop asking the question because I was starting to feel, if you'd never seen one of these before, and now you're having to get your head around what is this thing? How does it work? And you're solving this problem. It seemed, again, I seem to be going too far. I have a new problem I ask. It's different. I'm not going to tell it here, but it follows that kind of same idea. And what I realize is that the best interview questions for developers work for every level. And it's just that the more experienced you are, the more elegantly you can solve it. But if a student can solve it, a very senior developer can solve it. I like those. And I like this idea that if you invent your own questions and you ask them over time, you get to learn lots and lots of different ways to approach it. I really did appreciate that about my Coke machine question. Now we do stuff differently. Now, there was a time, I think I was still a developer when somebody asked me to do a take-home test or emailed me a problem that they wanted me to solve on my own time. I think the first time I got that was a long time ago, but the first time I got that, I said, no, I'm not doing this for you. Plenty of people willing to interview me without asking me to do a bunch of hours of homework. Because again, even though I was getting homework, it wasn't that I was getting a shorter interview process. It was still going to be like a 2-day interview process. So I'm like, why am I doing this for you? I can go just do my normal whiteboard stuff and not have to do this just to talk to you. Eventually somebody did it, and it was kind of a cool problem. They let me pick what I wanted to do. They just asked how to use some stuff, and then it was kind of fun, so I did it. But I always felt a little weird about this thing, and now it is quite common to ask developers to do this. Again, I think as we kind of moved into this world of moving into more of an employer's market, maybe we'll do it more. I was never a fan of it. However, and there's a different chapter in the book where I actually talk about why I don't like these things, why I think it actually requires a level of privilege to be able to have the time and energy to do it, that's maybe unfair. That said, one of the things we've done at a bunch of companies where I've been CTO, and especially where I've been responsible, which is always for the developer interview process, is we usually give candidates a choice. Hey, you can do this if you prefer. You can do like a in-person coding assignment. Usually it's going to be pair programmed as opposed to you doing a whiteboard or whatever. Or you can send us some code of yours that you're particularly proud of and that you wrote on your own. That's not under NDA or IP owned by somebody else or whatever, that you can share that. And then we can just talk through that code. And I like that idea of giving people a choice. And hey, we need to establish your skills. And that's a requirement for the job. We need to know you can do the job, but we're going to give you a bunch of different choices and you can pick the one that is most appealing to you. And honestly, given the way I feel about this, I'm always surprised how popular the take-home programming assignment is. Like when given a choice, actually a lot of people end up choosing that, which I never would have. But I understand, oh, okay, like I see why, given a choice, like what people do, what they're most comfortable with. And if a lot of companies are asking you to do this, and maybe you get very comfortable with. For me, it was, I was very comfortable doing whiteboard coding interviews because I did them for years on both sides. So, we'll continue to evolve the developer interview process. It's just the state of the industry. I'm sure somebody's going to come up with a new innovation or a new way of doing it, and we'll all adopt it. That's kind of the way these things work. And I'll say what I look for in a candidate is going to be different. I've interviewed, at lots of different companies before I became a manager as a developer, and you could tell a lot about the company by the kind of questions they would ask you. And different companies care about different things. And to be honest, different hiring managers care about different things. I think something that gets lost, especially if you're in an employer's market, so it's a bit more of a struggle to find a job, and maybe you haven't got through those processes enough, or you've gone through several processes and haven't gotten an offer. It becomes very tempting to just try and get through the interview and try and, not ask any questions and just try and be amazingly amenable. Pay attention to how they treat you as a candidate. Pay attention to the questions they're asking, the attitude of the people interviewing you. If you're a hiring manager, be nice to your candidates. Treat them like people. And it gets tough when you got 100 people sending you resumes for a role, or you've been going through a process for a long time. You've talked to a lot of candidates and you just haven't found the one you want. Don't forget, like, these are people and they're going to talk. They're friends as well. Like, even if you're, it's a hiring company time right now and you're like, well, they're lucky to be interviewing with us. In a year or two, it's going to be a job seekers market. And the people you were jerks to are now talking to their friends and telling them, I had this crappy experience interviewing with these people. Don't talk to them. Right. And all of a sudden, the word's out about your company and you're struggling to get candidates because people don't want to talk to your recruiters because they heard about what crummy interview processes you do. So keep that in mind if you're a hiring manager. If you're looking for a job, go through the process, do the best you can do, keep your energy level up, show your interest in the role, ask good questions. That's the best you can do, and solve the problems as best you can. If you're a hiring manager, treat your candidates well. Make sure that they have a good experience, even if you know early on, maybe in the interview day, like this isn't going well. Treat them extremely nicely. Treat your candidates well. They talk. They will talk to their friends. They will post online. They will talk about their experiences. And even if they don't have a chance of getting that role, you treat them in a positive, nice way. You are good to them. They will tell people what a great interview experience they had and how bummed they were they didn't get the job. instead of telling people all the horror stories they experienced interviewing with your company, that's never going to be good, right? You don't want that going on. So keep that in mind as well. Come up with interview questions that make sense for your candidates, make sense for the role, make sense for your company. If you ask people to do work for you, show them the respect of actually looking at what they've done and understanding the quality of their work and giving them the time that you're asking them to give to you. That's going to set you up exceptionally well as you hire. So now here is the chapter, What do I look for when hiring an engineer? What do I look for when hiring an engineer? Originally published on November 2nd, 2013. I don't spend much time on Quora, but I came across the question, what qualities should a software engineer have? Anyone who has worked with me can tell you that I am pretty opinionated about this subject. So since someone wasn't already answering what I would have, I decided to post an answer. Here is that answer. Over the last couple of decades, I've interviewed hundreds of software engineers for my teams at Microsoft, Adobe, Spotify, and other places. Over the years, I've honed in on a few things that I consider vital for anyone joining my organization. These are the kinds of things that I value as a hiring manager, of course. Others will have their critical criteria. These are in rough priority order. Number 1, pragmatism. I don't bother with tricky or difficult programming questions designed to test a corner case of your knowledge or some trivia. Instead, I ask a dead simple question, something anyone could do. Then I complicate it, and I complicate it again and again. I look for the point where you can no longer adapt your first answer. I want to know that you will throw away your first answer when it no longer makes sense. You'd be amazed how many engineers will hack on something that will never work when they could throw it away and do something much more straightforward in a quarter of the time. Number 2, interest. Do you actually like writing code every day? Do you read programming blogs for fun? Do you work on your own coding projects outside of work? If this will be your job, I want someone overjoyed that they get paid to write software, not someone who'd rather be doing something else. Number 3, attitude and humility. I've worked with brilliant people who are jerks. For every inch they move the product forward with their innovation or genius, they move the project back 2 inches by being impossible to work with. I want someone who will improve the team, not someone who feels everyone needs to do as they are told. Yes, this is an actual quote from a candidate. Number 4, intelligence. Yeah, you need to be smart. Writing software is part art and requires creativity, but it's also a lot about problem solving and just sheer brain power to figure out why this thing is crashing, but only on Tuesday when the moon is full. Number 5, programming languages and domain expertise. I have worked professionally with a dozen or more programming languages. Some I don't even remember anymore. While I have a lot of depth in some of them through years of experience, I've learned others as I need to in order to suit the project. I would prefer to see someone proficient in more than one language because that shows some breadth and a willingness to learn. But if you can code and are clever, see number 4, you can probably pick up whatever language we are working with reasonably fast. I hire for the long term. If you're a good fit, we can take a bit longer to get you up to speed. Similarly with domain experience, if you have aptitude, we can teach you. I do have a couple of caveats to number 5, though. If I'm hiring for a senior position that requires domain knowledge, yeah, that is on the job requirement, so you need to bring that. However, you would still need to handle numbers 1 through 4 in any case. On languages, there is one significant caveat. If we're doing C++ or C, you'll need some experience there. If you've only ever worked with high-level garbage-collected languages, bringing you up to speed will take too long. I've tried this too many times and realized that it usually isn't worth the effort. hopefully that chapter was helpful and you got some value from it. Maybe it can help you if you're building interview processes, if you're interviewing for companies. I hope it helped. If it did, please share this podcast. Send it to your friends, send it to your coworkers. It would really help me out. Also, share the newsletter. If you haven't subscribed, you should. You can get to the newsletter from kevingoldsmith.substack.com. If you're interested in the book, and I hope you are, if you haven't gotten it already, you can get more information about the book at itdependsbook.net. That has links to all the different stores. You can get an ebook, paperback, hardcover, audiobook, however you like. That also has links to the Substack and to this podcast to get more information and things like that. If you have questions, if you have comments, anything, you can also reach me at contact@itdependsbook.net. That's how you reach me, and I'd love to hear from you. If you're on the East Coast this fall, I will be giving a talk at Leading Edge, New York. Very happy to be back at Leading Edge. Very happy to be speaking again for a White October event. I love that company. I love the events they put on. So I'm really happy to do it. I just got this. So if you've already registered, I'm sorry. I just got this code. If you want to register for the event, you can use the code DistroKid. That's my current company where I'm CTO. So that's the discount code they used for people I send them. So that gets you 10% off the ticket price. So the code for 10% off is DistroKid, DistroKid. And that'll get you 10% off your ticket for Leading Edge, which is in September in New York City. So if you're subscribed to podcasts, I'll see you again in 2 weeks. If you're subscribed to the Substack, I will see you again next week. And hopefully you're having a great summer/winter, depending on where you live. See you soon. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.